And we're here.
Yes.
Well, hello. Here we are on our Thursday Life with Vern Jones.
Welcome. And Vern is an author, a scientist, the ultimate adventurer. I can't ever say that word. And he was telling us about some crazy things he's done in his life. So we're excited to share it with you. And Vern, whatever you want to start with, tell us your craziest story. We can jump straight into DB Cooper, whatever you want to talk about.
I've had some wonderful adventures in my life. One of my favorites was climbing Kilimanjaro with two of my daughters and their husband. So that was 5 years ago. It was the greatest experience of my life. And I've also had the opportunity to almost be landed on by a full adult humpback whale who missed me by about 20 feet. Fortunately for me, but missed a great obituary. So, but yeah, I like diving with sharks. I like climbing mountains and just different adventures. So, yeah. And then I got dragged into this DB Cooper thing. So it was it was the last thing I ever thought would happen, because I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I actually DB Cooper's story occurred in 1971, the first year I went to college. And so I do remember part of that. It was really bizarre. 71 was a really strange time to put in context. I mean, the world was just going nuts. I mean, the Vietnam War protests were rampant. Civil rights protests were going in every city. The FBI office in Pennsylvania had been broken into, and they discovered that the FBI was secretly taping and blackmailing people in the civil rights movement, like Martin Luther King, and the Pentagon Papers were just about to break. So all hell was breaking loose when Cooper decided to pull this hijacking. So it was a weird time at that. I mean, we think it's crazy times now. That was really weird. Yeah.
I know it's just a matter of like perspective. Everyone thinks now is crazy, but if you just look back a few decades, it was completely crazy in different, somewhat the same ways.
Right,
So
right.
what pulled you into this whole DB Cooper conspiracy craziness that's out there?
Yeah, we started a publishing company in 2011, and we just wanted to publish new and emerging authors who weren't getting a good opportunity to actually sell their books and get their story heard. And so we thought we could do it better. We have another business that actually pays all the bills, so we could. My wife and I said, "Oh, what the heck, we can do this." So we started the publishing company. We met a lot of wonderful authors with really fun stories. We don't publish many books at all every year, only ones that there's 4 of us in the management team, and we all 4 have to say, this is something we want to do. And if one says, nah, that's out, we don't do it. So 2016, one of our editors came to me and actually came to our director of publishing, Dirk, and said, you really need to hear this story from my uncle. It's fascinating, and he doesn't trust big publishers because they stole a book from him one time, and so he wants someone he could trust, which was flattering. So anyway, Dirk looked into it, and then he called me, and he said, you're going to hate this story, but you have to listen to me. And I said, okay, what's the deal? And he said, well, this guy really believes that he has an unsolved mystery. And it's like, I'm not sure I want to get into that that whole area. And so then he told me it was his best friend was the guy who was DB Cooper. And I immediately said, I don't want to deal with this nut job. The last thing the world needs is another deathbed confession that they were DB Cooper. I'm not interested. And he said, no, that's not it. You really have to listen to this guy. I said, no, I don't. And that was before COVID. So we were spending February and March down in the Keys. So we were on our way down there with our dogs. And Derek called me back in and said, I'm serious, you got to call this guy. I said, oh, you're killing me. And so I said, all right, okay, I'll talk to him. So I talked to him. Well, he wasn't a nut job. I still wasn't interested. But this guy was saying, you've got to come and see my evidence. Well, he lived in DeLand, Florida, named Carl Lauren. And so he said, just stop and see my evidence before you go back to Michigan. So I did. I told my wife that she was there with the dogs in the hotel and said, I'll be back in an hour and a half. I don't expect. About 5 hours later, I called and said, sorry, this is, we will go to dinner, but that was really an interesting story. And what I learned during that time, beyond what I was really convinced of, not that he was Cooper, that took me a couple of years, but that he actually had spent his life after the hijacking traveling the world and doing assassinations from various countries. And that was indisputable. Carol said, you have to look at these passports. So this guy had 5 passports that were filled. He had two diaries, and they had bank account numbers all over the globe. This guy he applied to the CIA. I saw that application and they denied it, but he was fluent in Russian and Polish, and he learned Indonesian. And so he learned Russian and Polish before he was even learned English. He was raised in Detroit, but he clearly traveled all over the world. His passport showed him in cities where a couple of very famous assassinations took place from very bad people. And so that to me was interesting. I mean, he also had a little bitty spy camera that was made in 1970 that was just tiny. And they said it was used by spies. And at that time, cameras, right? So,
yes.
I was going to say, was it the size of a shoe and they thought it was tiny?
Yes.
Because tiny in the 70s doesn't seem to go together.
Smaller. It was like this big.
Oh, wow.
And it was and he had a bulletproof vest that he had. It was nuts. So I was convinced that would be an interesting story. I just wanted to learn more about this guy, but I wasn't convinced even close that he was D.B. Cooper. So we went back and looked into it more and see if there was a story. And finally, I told Carl and his wife Loretta that I'd publish the book only if I was truly convinced that he was D.B. Cooper, because that's what Carl wanted to publish. Not anything about his life afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Publish the D.B. Cooper story. And so what Carl had was Walter had confessed to him for over 12 years verbally. He had confessed to Walt had confessed to his niece, Lisa Story, and his sister. And he'd also confessed to a couple of other people, relatives. And so he had all these confessions. And so then we started looking into, Carl had a little trailer behind his house, and his wife had kicked him out of the house because he had all this Walter Recca Cooper stuff, and Loretta's very conscious of her house. And it's like, you can still do this, but they bought him a little bitty travel trailer, and we walked into it, and it looked like a crime scene investigation with maps and lines drawn all over the place. And it was crazy. And so Dirk and I were looking at it, and we tend to film things when we're working with authors. And so we were filming, and all of a sudden, after we were there for like 2.5 hours, our second visit there, we saw this little plastic box, and we looked in it, and I said, what are those? And actually, Dirk said, what are those? And they were little cassettes. And Carl said, well, those were the conversations I recorded with Walter when he confessed to me. And it's like, you had a confession? And a confession? You didn't tell us about it? And he said, why, don't you trust me? It's like, no.
No, exactly. Lead
Right?
with the tapes is what I would say. Lead with that next time.
Over 3 hours worth of audio tapes.
Oh,
wow.
About various aspects of the hijacking and what he did leading up to it. And it was crazy sitting there listening to these things, And then Carl said, well, I also found an eyewitness after the hijacking. And I'm like, oh, how did you do this? And well, on the audio tapes, as we listened to them, we transcribed them. Carl was saying that, ask Walter how he got home after the landing, after he landed. And so Carl said, Walter said, I didn't know how I got there. But after I landed, as I was coming, it was an overcast night after he jumped, and he said I could see a couple of bridges and I could see water where it broke into a different river. And then he saw a line of cars, a couple of cars that were driving. He could see their headlights because it was dark. And so he only had a short time, but that's what he saw. And so he landed and he got up and he walked out to where the cars were, and he looked down the street and saw a vapor light. There's nothing else around. And so he walked down to one that turned out to be a little cafe. And it had a gas pumps. This is how Walter described it. He said he jumped in a suit because he wanted to look like a businessman when he hijacked the plane.
Appearances are important.
Yes.
Yes.
And so when he jumped, I don't know if we talked I shouldn't assume that everyone knows what happened, but basically in 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man went to the Portland airport, bought a ticket, one-way ticket to Seattle, which was not uncommon at that time, and boarded the flight, a very short flight. Before it even took off, he gave the stewardess a letter saying, this plane's being hijacked. I need you to sit down next to me, and I'll tell you what we need to do. He gave her the note. She was a good-looking stewardess. She thought he was flirting with her, which happened a lot at that time. And so she read it. So then he said, you need to read this, seriously. And so she read it, and she did sit by him. And so he demanded, he wanted them to fly him to Mexico, which was what, again, for a little perspective, between 1968 and 1972, there were 131 hijackings in the United States of airlines. So hijacked airlines were really, really common at that time, but most of them wanted to fly to Cuba. So he's leaving Seattle and he wants to go to Mexico. But he also demanded $200,000 in used $20 bills. He wanted them to put it in a knapsack. He demanded 2 full sets of parachutes, 2 front packs and 2 backpacks. And they wanted them brought in. And then he agreed to let the people go. He wanted them to refuel the plane. He wanted the plane to fly at 10,000 feet, so it wouldn't have to be it wouldn't have to be pressurized. And so, for all the world, it looked like he was going to jump out, but it also looked like he was going to take a hijacker because he asked for 2 parachutes. So anyway, they gave him the money. They didn't put it in a knapsack. They put it in a bank bag with a drawstring that said the Bank of Seattle or whatever. And so when he got it, he said, oh, I can't put this on my pack, so I have to strap it around my waist. And he had a suit coat and an overcoat. And so he wrapped it around there. He took some lines out of one of the parachute and tied it around his waist and his legs. And so then he jumped out with 1 parachute and never seen again. And so where Walter filled this in, he said he landed. Walter was uniquely qualified for this. He was a pararescue survival specialist, which is with the U.S. Air Force. It is the most demanding division. I have been told by other specialists, they're called PJs, but I was told by other people that Navy SEALs apply and don't get in. And so it's a very demanding, and they're taught to jump into, I have an article with him jumping into the Canadian Ocean up by Labrador in the winter. And they were just had to get out and survive. Okay, that's part of their training. But so anyway, he was very qualified. He landed and he saw those things. He walked to this is a cafe, and he said he walked in and there was one customer in there, and he called him the cowboy because he had a cowboy hat, cowboy shirt, cowboy boots, and he had a guitar leaning on the counter next to him. Walter said they didn't serve alcohol, and they were open till midnight the day before Thanksgiving. And so he didn't know where he was. He called his friend, say, I need a ride, but he didn't know where he was. So he had to ask Cowboy if he would come over and tell his friend where he was.
Yeah.
And so Cowboy thought it was really unusual. But yes, he said he would do it. And so then after he gave him the directions and Walter sat back down, Cowboy got up and got in a dump truck and drove away. Pretty graphic description, right? So
Yeah.
Mhm. Yes.
It would take a heck of a imagination to get that detailed of a story out.
right. And so Walter said he didn't know where he landed. So, and this is really a contention with the Cooperites, the Cooper vortex, they're called, is that he landed there. So we didn't have a choice. That was where we believe he landed. And either it happened or he didn't happen. That's where we approached this from. And so when Carl doesn't use a computer, never did. And never, as a matter of fact, a funny short story, when I'd ask him for clarifications on something, he's down by Daytona Beach, and I'm up in Western Michigan. And it's like, okay, I need you to clarify this. Could you explain this part? And he would print it out by hand on lined paper. His wife would take a picture of each page and email me one page at a time of a 30-page answer. All right. So that was how we communicated. But so anyway, Carl went out there and he went to this place, a town. He narrowed it down to Cle Elum, Washington, because there was actually a cafe there that happened to burn down and was replaced by a fire station, but it burned down in the late 70s. But so that was where he went. He asked the guy that owned the service station there in town, I'm looking for a guy who probably sang country western music on weekends and who worked at the daytime as a dump truck driver. And so the owner there said, I don't know, but my dad would have, because he would own the station then. And they found him, and this guy's name was Jeff O'Shaughnessy. So we went out to interview this guy, and I went to the local newspaper, and the reporter there said, I said, I have a favor. And I was really afraid of this answer. I was like, this guy was a witness to an incident that happened in the 70s. And he said he remembered something because Carl had called and talked to him, this incident. And I said, can you tell me anything about a guy named Jeff O'Shaughnessy? And the guy looked me straight in the eyes and said, if Jeff O'Shaughnessy is your witness, you couldn't have found a better witness. He was a former police officer until they did away with the police department. So he was an observer. And they said he had just won the award for Mr. Coal because he had saved some guy's life. He worked in a coal mine as a driver. It's just crazy. So we interviewed Jeff, and Jeff was just as forthright. And he said, I remember it. He said, because I didn't believe him. The guy told me his car broke down. If your car breaks down, you know where you are.
Right? Yes, because you drove there. So.
Right. And he said the other thing is he had this overcoat, and it was bundled around something. It was sleeting, rain, snow, and he had it wrapped under his arm. And he said he was drenched. His face was red. He was just freezing, but he wouldn't let go of this thing under his arm. So that was how we found an eyewitness, and Jeff was incredible.
But at the time, I mean, Jeff thought this guy was suspicious, but didn't correlate him to DB Cooper at all.
No, the biggest thing was that there was the discrepancy that everyone has is our flight path, because the FBI reported that the flight path literally went straight south from Seattle to Portland. And this flight, Walter, landed like 90 degrees, just straight east. And so everyone's saying no, and all the people that are researching it, just because of the flight path, say, no, that can't be. That's just, it's not true. The FBI said they went this way. Well, we know that they wanted Walter to work for he didn't work for the CIA. Whenever Carl would say, when you work for the CIA, he said, I didn't work for them. I work for all of them. Walter also had a British passport, Walter also had a KGB identification with his picture on it, a stamp seal, and a leather. Yeah, I had all those in our possession. Now his niece has them. I gave them to her, but those were the things. I mean, it was very clear so he said, but he went through this training. The funny part was that he was recruited after the hijacking. Well, first the flight path. We believe that the FBI knew that was Walter when they were on the ground. They landed in Seattle, and then that's when they refueled the plane. They let the passengers off and everything like that. I think that the FBI at that time knew. He had applied to the CIA a couple of years earlier. He had been rejected. We have his rejection letter. But he had made a friend in Elsinore, California, when he went to apply. And this guy followed him, and this guy got him a job with a company called Vernell Corporation in January 1971. Vernell Corporation clearly is in they fund military operations all over the world. They actually have a lot of oil wells in the oceans. And so, but they clearly, there's an interview in Newsweek magazine where they asked the vice president of Vernell, he said, "We think you guys are mercenaries." And his response was, "No, we're not mercenaries. Mercenaries kill people. We pay people to do that." Yeah,
they're just funding the mercenaries.
Vernell still provides security for the Saudi family, the royal family. They're pretty clearly involved in espionage. So they were watching him, and he'd got a job part-time with him in 71. And then after the hijacking, he went to he was working at the Grand Coulee Dam as a welder. And they, two guys pulled him aside and said, "Hey, Walter, you want to have a beer after work at the Brown Derby?" And Walter never turned down a drink. And so he went there. Two guys came in, sat down, they ordered beer. The waitress left, and one of the guys, this is Walter's story, he looked at me and said, "Do you want to spend the rest of your life in prison?" And he said, "No." And they said, "Then you work for us." I thought that was a weird story that was recorded in 2008. That's when the recording took place. My wife and I are watching a movie called American Made with Tom Cruise. It's about Barry Seal, who was recruited because he was an airline pilot. He was smuggling contraband and drugs in from Colombia when he was coming in. He went to an airport bar. This guy comes over to him and says, "You're Barry Seal." And he said, "Yeah." And he stood down and said, "Okay, you understand you could go to prison." And I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, "Then you work for me," and stood up and walked away. It was literally the same scenario in a movie made in 2017 that mimicked what Walter said in 2008. So it was that whole connection with that is just crazy, uncanny. But we realized that the evidence that we had that Walter was Cooper was all confessions, the audio tapes. We had other witnesses. We tracked the money, and this guy sold Walter the house. Walter bought a house with the money up in Spokane. Shortly afterwards, he bought a car after that. And so we tracked down the guy that sold him the house. We had all these people, but it was all this verbal evidence. And then Walter also had a written confession. And so I said, I need to know if Carl's telling the truth, if Walter was telling the truth when the two of them were talking on the audio, if Lisa, his niece, is telling the truth, or if she's some nut job. And then the guy that sold him the car, all these people, and especially Jeff O'Shaughnessy, I need to know, is this guy telling the truth? Fortunately, we had published a book a couple of years before that by a guy named Joe Koenig, and Joe is a forensic linguist. Joe is one of the most renowned forensic linguists in the United States. His book was called Getting the Truth. It's fascinating. It just tells you how to discern when people are being deceitful, or it's just in their either written or verbal, and he's wonderful. The book is really fascinating. He analyzed the John Benet Ramsey ransom letter.
Oh,
He disclosed who wrote it. He said, "I don't know who killed him, but I know who wrote it." He did the Woody Allen with this stepdaughter, I think. When they combating. Yeah, he analyzed those two. Oh my gosh, he's really, really good. So I called Joe and said, "Okay, I have a project. I'm really hoping you'll help me with it." Joe, by the way, was also the lead investigator in the Hoffa disappearance for the Michigan State.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I said, "Joe, you have a chance to get involved with two of the mothers."
Yes.
In the United States. And Joe said, he thought about it for a minute, and then he said, "Let me see some of the stuff you have." And so he gave him the audio tapes that were transcribed and all this stuff. And he's like, "Yeah, I'd like to do this." And he analyzed Carl, our witness. I was really worried about that one. It's like, if he's lying, our whole case is done, and I'm done. I'm not publishing, right? And Joe said, I don't see any signs of deceit. This guy he's honest. He tells me what he knows, and he doesn't fill in what he doesn't know. And he said, "I don't see any signs of deceit whatsoever. He believes he's telling the truth." And so I'm like, all right. Then he went over the audio tapes, and he just said, he literally went through every witness: Carl Lauren, Carl's wife, his niece, Lisa Story. We brought her, and Joe analyzed hers. And Lisa happens to be a very highly respected lady in Las Vegas who's in, I don't know her official title, but she's in charge of all the public relations for all the waterworks for Las Vegas. So she has a staff of, like, I don't know, 35 or something like that. She's really intelligent. She is like my uncle was B.B. Cooper. It was really pretty cool. So, and she filled in, and Joe just said she's telling the truth. So once Joe did all that, I said, all right, I finally believe it. But that's what it took for me to get there and for us to publish the book. So,
well, that's, great. You like checked it out before you're like on board and putting them through your own publishing company.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was a crazy 3 years before we published. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you really were just like thrown into this DB Cooper story.
Yeah, screaming and kicking, basically. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Trying to find any way out. Like, oh, nope, we better jump. We better jump.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So, and you might get into your book. I did order a copy, so I'm excited to read it. But why do you think that he was a different flight plan than what the FBI is? Zane, one of our avid listeners, was it the weather that may have changed the flight path? Was it he was being sneaky? I don't know.
Well, it's a really good question. And the weird part was they were in Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
And Seattle is one of the main, they have the main flight control for the entire Northwest. And so they were in Seattle, and the flight plan wasn't determined in Seattle. Another logical place that was Northwest Orient, they were out of Minneapolis. So it's like, well, maybe Minneapolis just, prescribed the flight plan. No, they didn't do it. It was done out of Sacramento, California, which is a really weird place because the only thing Sacramento has is an Air Force base that was used by the CIA in Vietnam. They did all their CIA operations in Vietnam out of Sacramento Air Force Base. And so, it was weird to me that out of whoever decided that would decide that. So I really think that they were just misleading. It was a really overcast night. They had a couple of jets that tried to follow it, but it was so overcast and they were flying so low and they were flying so slow because they had the flaps down. And so the the plane was flying just above stall speed, literally. And that's what Cooper demanded so that he could jump easier. And so the jets couldn't follow him because they can't fly that slow. So they would just go. And so they never really followed him. And the only time the jets really picked them up was once it got down to Bend, Oregon. And so the FBI said that was the flight path immediately. But we weren't worried about what the FBI said because everybody in the Cooper vortex thinks the FBI is misleading them about something. Everybody. They just won't admit that this guy that I picked out of thin air, or just they won't admit that he's because of whatever, right? Well, we had a pretty good reason why they didn't, because they needed Walter. This was the middle of the Cold War. They needed Walter's skills as a trained killer with our special forces, a survivalist, one of the best renowned. He was the most experienced parachutist in the United States, or certainly one of them. And they needed him at that point, and they had already started the recruitment process. He was and we have all this. So I think they just knew that, and they just said, we don't want to. It's so weird. The FBI did so many un-FBI things after the hijacking. They declared that the flight path went right to Portland. All right. And then that goes, and they actually said where he jumped was right over a place called Ariel. I went to Ariel. Ariel is not a town. Ariel is a crossroads in the middle of the forest on our way to Mount St. Helens that our family climbed. Okay. So we stopped in there, and so we know the area. But the weird thing to me is here that is very few roads in and out of this area around Ariel. They never set up roadblocks to catch the hijacker. Wouldn't that be the logical thing? I mean, he's on foot. He's got to get out some way. Wouldn't you set up that? Well, they didn't. They didn't even do flyovers in the area. These parachutes that he used are round parachutes. You can't steer them. They drop basically straight down or wherever the wind carries you. And so what happens in a heavy forest is the canopy catches in the top of the trees, right? And so then they have to cut themselves out and get down some way safely down to the forest. They didn't do any flyovers to see if there was a big parachute hanging up in some trees somewhere. They didn't do that for 13 hours. Then they finally sent them. They waited 5 months to organize a search party.
What's good is 5 months.
Yeah. Yep. And so, I mean, you had to know that there were thousands of hunters in that area that would love to go out and try to find someone who had $200,000 in cash, right? Now, they didn't organize it for 5 months. The other thing that really was weird happened is they did a sketch of Cooper. And the sketch on the front of my book was the sketch that was when Cooper hijacked the plane. They were in the plane for several hours, and the flight attendant, or stewardess that they call it that time, that spent all of her time with him was Tina Mucklow. And Tina sat next to him, lit cigarettes for him, gave him alcohol, and talked to him, took all the demands. She brought the parachutes in, the money in, and he actually offered her and the other stewardess some of the packs of the money. But she was right there with him. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I will go ahead and take some of that.
That's an excellent tip. Thank you.
So they interviewed her right after, and she did a sketch that day that she landed, and she was really happy with it. She came back 3 days later and said, I'm 100% confident that's what he looked like. Well, the FBI then went and talked to the ticket agent that sold him the ticket, who had an interaction with him for a couple of minutes and probably just wanted him out of the way, right? Some of the other passengers, none of the passengers knew they were hijacked because they actually moved there weren't very many people in the plane, and they moved them up towards first class and left him in the back. And there was one passenger that was kind of a young guy who was kind of jealous that this good-looking stewardess was spending so much time with this old guy, he's 30 years old, 38 years old. And so, but he's, looked at him a little bit, but he had sunglasses on, and the FBI talked to those people and changed the sketch to make it look like the sketch that everyone recognizes as D.B. Cooper. And Mucklow said, that's not him. And so, I mean, they did all these just weird things. The special agent in charge is Charlie Farrell. He was in Seattle. Well, the plane landed in Reno. And that's where all the evidence was. The special agent in charge didn't go to Reno. And literally, they lost a lot of the evidence. The cigarette butts, they had no, that he smoked.
I was going to ask about like DNA, because that's always been mine and my husband's question. Why can't they test the DNA now from the cigarettes?
Right. They don't have it. They lost them.
Okay. That would be a good reason.
Now, is this the great conspiracy that the government's covering up for everything? But did they lose them, or did they actually lose them?
Well, we don't know, because first of all, why wouldn't he go down and gather the evidence, right? But he also looked at some magazines and stuff. And keep in mind, DNA wasn't a thing in 1971.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah. They didn't know the initials. Okay. There was no, but you would think that they would keep the evidence. But they didn't. They lost it, and they had no idea where it is. And there's several other parts of the evidence that they just say we don't have. They do claim to have some evidence, but we're not really sure from what. And so they did try doing some DNA. Carl actually, Walter told Carl that I'll confess to you, but you can't release this until I die. That's what you have to promise me. And Carl said, okay. And he said, don't ever DNA me, because DNA, he died in 2014. So he said, DNA me. Well, Carl was a good friend, but he went up to see him, and he knew that Walter was quite ill. And so Walter had a cough, and so he was spitting up into Kleenex. And when Walter went to the restroom, Carl used tweezers and put them in a plastic bag, a couple of the Kleenex, and so he got some DNA from him. He took it back to DeLand, Florida with him, and he took it to an attorney there who had the biggest ad in the Daytona Beach newspaper, who happened to be the guy who prosecuted the lady, the woman mass murderer that they made the movie Monster about.
Eileen Wuornos.
Oh, yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And he was the one that he prosecuted her. So now he's the defense attorney, and his name is David Damore. So Carl took it there and said, okay, I'm going to submit this. I won't tell you who my client is, who my friend is. I don't want you to tell the FBI who I am. I want you to send this to a DNA lab and have it profiled. And then I want to send that to the FBI, to Larry Carr, who was the agent in charge at that time in Seattle. And he did. And so we talked to Damore, and we took Joe down, and Joe also interviewed him and said, yes, this guy's telling the truth. This is what happened. And so he literally, as Carl said, they sent it to, first of all, Damore had emails with Carr, and he said, I'm going to send this to you, and I want you to see if it matches your Cooper evidence. And Carr said to him on a conversation, at least Damore told us that, he said, it's not going to match. And he said, well, I'm going to send it to you. How long is it going to take? And Carr said, once I get it, I'll have it back in 3 days. So Damore overnighted it to Seattle to Carr. A week, actually, 5 or 6 days passed. Walter in Detroit, or north of Detroit, calls Carl and said, why the F did you DNA me, you son of a bitch? And he said, we're done talking.
Oh, no.
Damore calls Carr, the FBI agent. Carr said, we don't have it yet. We don't have the evidence. We don't have it back yet. We're really busy in Quantico. We can't get it. It took him 74 days for Carr to finally, and then he just emailed him and said, doesn't match.
Period. End of conversation.
Yes.
Doesn't match.
Don't ask again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because it's usually this big old form with all this information. Oh, it's a chance of
so many markers.
Yeah. Yes.
No results. That's it. Yeah. No match. Yeah. So anyway, I mean, all these things, they're so un-FBI like, right? And it's just like they can't admit it. It's not. And whenever I told Joe, because Joe is, I mean, my God, he was retired Michigan State Police. He was an investigator. He's, you know, he works with the FBI and cases. And he said it's not a conspiracy. He said it's the greater good, Vern. We all know that. And we all know that the greater good is, you know, if like Joe investigating the Hoffa disappearance, he said, we arrested people that worked for the Teamsters that we knew had killed people. Mm-hmm. And we said, we need evidence. And he said, that's the way it works. You know, he said, you go to the low level, mid level, and you get cooperation. And he said they really needed Walter, and they did take Walter. And he literally had no passport. And then he actually got his first passport about a year later after he went through this training with him. And it was under it was an assumed name, Rekka. His name was really Pika, but he had jumped bail. And so in order to make his artificial name, he just drew a line from the P down to the bottom to make it an R for Rekka. It was 1971, folks. That's the way it was.
Like, it was easy to change your name then.
Yeah, like that's a whole nother story about.
Yes, yeah. So he actually got his passport and then went to 38 countries in the next 8 years. Indonesia, all over the world. Yeah, it's crazy. So, yeah, that's the flight path. It's interesting, and you know the other thing was funny is that they're like, well, they would never have lost it, and you know, in 2014, Malaysia Airline Flight 370. You remember that?
Yeah, I do, and it boggles my mind to this day.
20 minutes after takeoff, disappeared and was gone forever. And with satellites and everything that we have, the plane was twice as big as a 727. It was 40 years newer than the 727. And they're saying, oh, their flight path couldn't have been wrong. So you must. So I think there's a lot of reason to believe that that they could mislead or misdirect. Yeah, and so and Joe Koenig even said I could make a good argument that the FBI misdirected them because they didn't want a bunch of hillbillies out there crashing through the woods looking for and destroying evidence. And so that might have been but yeah, so we listened to the flight path, but it's like, you know what, we know where Walter landed. That's it. And we are absolutely convinced that Walter was telling the truth and that Cowboy was telling the truth and that Carl and Lisa and all those other people were telling the truth. Yeah. And then, you know, Walter had the money, he put it in the Canadian bank. And before he died, his relatives went and withdrew significant money from a Canadian bank at that point. So we have evidence. Everybody else has a theory. All these people say, oh, well, I read the FBI evidence and everything, and I believe I've uncovered it and discovered something that they missed all this time. And I'm just saying they knew who it was. They just didn't solve it right then.
So back in 2017, they said they found DNA on the tie. I'm sorry. No. Okay, Google off. Sorry, my Google decided to talk to us all of a sudden. Yeah. The FBI might be listening for all we know.
Right. Up to respond. They don't respond. I tried to get Larry Carr to respond for my book, but he wouldn't respond.
They're just coming over to Google to say it doesn't match.
Yeah.
The DNA. Yeah. 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 The metals on the tie. Walter was a construction worker. He was really poor. And he actually told his Carl, he said, it was two things. He was working on the Grand Coulee Dam. I could either fall off the dam and die, and my wife and 2 children would have some money, or else I hijack a plane. And he always talked about, he and Carl were one of the original parachute groups in the United States in the 50s. And Carl would say they'd come back afterwards and they drink, and Walter would often talk about robbing a plane. He said, I watched all those movies where they rob a bank and then they want to ride to an airplane and why don't I just rob the plane? And he said he recalled that a couple of conversations. And as a matter of fact, another member of their group called Carl the night of the hijacking and said, Carl, what the F did Walter just do? And neither one of them knew he was out in Washington at the time, but that was how they said. And Carl said, yeah, you're right. It was Walter. They knew it at the time, but it took them a long time to actually admit it. So the DNA, the conversations they had were in, again, 2000 on tape or 2008. They started before that. Walter said in 2000, when he prepared for the hijacking, he was living in Heartline, Washington, a really tiny little farming town. He drove all the way to Spokane and he went to a thrift shop. He didn't have a suit. He wanted to look like a businessman. He bought shoes. He bought a suit. He bought a shirt. He bought a tie. He bought the briefcase and then he went to a hardware store and bought flares and a timer to make it look like a bomb. And so he bought all of that the week before the hijacking. And he told us that in 2008. So I know Tom Kay, who did the DNA, by the way. I like Tom. I think he does good work. But you know what? I don't care who owned the tie before Walter. Yeah. It doesn't really change my opinion that Walter jumped. But it's fascinating that they want to spend so much time on it.
Yeah. So the other question, a child found money in the area that they say is possibly related to DB Cooper. Does this, right? Do you think Walter lost some of the money as he was jumping, or
sprinkled it about?
This is what we believe. We know that, again, we're going back to 2008 when they're talking on the tape. Walter didn't know where he was. So he called his best friend, who was living in Everett, Washington at the time, and he said, you have to come and get me. And his best friend was a petty thief. Walter said, had already been convicted of an armed robbery and stuff like that, but he was drunk and they got arrested because his driver was parked the wrong way on a one-way street. And so they were arrested immediately. So he'd already done that. And so then that's when he jumped bail and stuff. And so that was Walter. Well, his friend Don was a petty criminal. And Carl knew him also. And Carl and Don said, yeah, what you don't want to do is leave your wallet on the table when Don's in the room. Okay. So he wasn't like a big time criminal, but he was a petty thief. And so when Don Brennan is his name, when he came and picked up Walter, they got in the car, and according to Walter's tape version, he said yes, he gave Don, took 3 of the bundles of the money out of the bag and put it in Don's pocket and said, there, now we're in this together. And Don told him, yeah, its prisons are filled with people like you and me. And he was really, really paranoid. Well, the FBI said that they interviewed every parachutist, recreational parachutist and fire jumper in the Northwest. Don was also a parachutist. He jumped with Walter at the same places. Walter jumped all over the place there. And so they did interview Don, but Don was 6'3" and Brian Cooper 5'10". So they said it's not him, but he was so paranoid. He was really, really paranoid about that. And Don and Carl talked about, you can't even talk to him because he'll hang up on you as soon as you talk about the money. And so we do know that Don moved down to Olympia, and that about a month and a half before the money was found by the Ingram family, and I'll put found in quotes, that Don left and went up to Alaska without notice and didn't come back. And so I don't know what happened to it, but I know that Don had about that amount of money. It was 3 bundles of money. They said that the FBI story is absolutely goofy because they said that Cooper landed south of Tennebar where the money was found. And so their explanation was that Cooper got all wrapped up in the wires from the parachute, and he drowned and got carried out. But some of the money was in the bag, and it caught on a propeller of a boat that was going up the river. And then 3 of the bundles escaped from the bag and got settled in this sandbar. That was their explanation. The weird part is that when Tina Mucklow, who saw the money and was right there when they brought it, she talked about the money being in bank bands. We all know that those are paper bands, right? Go around.
Yes.
And she called them bank bands. She was very specific. 10 of our money was found with rubber bands. So now this propeller took the paper off and replaced it apparently with rubber. I don't know how, but the whole idea of rubber bands surviving, I mean, it was what, 9 years later? In sand and mud and water seems really highly unlikely. As with other investigators, other people have different suspects. One of them, Tom Colbert, had a really good explanation for what he believes is that, and it was, I think it was something close to that. We tried to make connections with that, but we couldn't. But I think that was money that Don had, and whether he gave it to someone and tried to turn it in for rewards, or I don't really know. But I believe the origin is the money that Don had. It was the same 3 bundles. Right. So.
Wow.
Interesting.
Yes.
Did Tina, the stewardess, ever release her version of the sketch again? Did she ever redraw that?
No, Tina was really apparently traumatized by the whole thing. She was a flight attendant for a few more years, but it really bothered her, and all the attention really bothered her. And she asked not to be contacted, and she actually went to a convent for several years. And so one of this Tom Colbert, who had another suspect, but he did one of the Cooper specials, and he said he tried to interview her. He tried to get her to come in and identify his suspect as Cooper, and she didn't, and he was mad, said he thought he's suing the FBI because she didn't identify his, but she doesn't want to be contacted. We tried, and she said she would rather not, and it's like, you have to respect some people.
Sure.
You know, if it's not traumatizing. I have 4 girls, and I don't.
Wow.
I know. That's why. But anyway, it's I just think that could be a really traumatic experience for someone believing that they were going to die or be forced to jump out of an airplane into God knows where. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure the amount of interviews that the police and FBI made her do afterwards, like that they required her, was not easy. Just telling her, oh, you need to remember more. It's all resting on your shoulders. That's a lot of pressure for someone.
Yeah. Yeah. As I was talking in my book, it's like, yeah, I can understand it was 1971. She was a female. We can't trust her, right? Okay. So,
yeah.
We were
and
not
on top of that,
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So on top of that, the media pressure of everyone talking about this, I'm sure she got all kinds of death threats, reporters at her doorstep. I mean, the inundation that happens to victims when people don't believe that they're truly victims it still happens today. We deal with that a lot with the cases that we cover. So I can fully understand her not wanting to be contacted at this point.
Yeah, I did too. I thought we'd make an effort, and as soon as she said no, it's no. Okay.
Yeah.
We didn't need it. It would have been nice. It would have been wonderful if she had identified him, but we had other eyewitnesses and people who were willing to talk, and it's time to leave her alone, I think.
Yeah.
And it sounds as though you have the most proof of anyone's DB Cooper theories ever out there.
Yeah, like I said, all we have is evidence, you know. we have evidence, and it's verified by Joe's. The other thing is, Joe Koenig wrote this book, right? And he is renowned all over the United States as a linguist. So he sent his book and his book is Getting the Truth. This is there, I can show it. I am Getting the Truth, IMDb Cooper. This is one of the endorsements. Okay, it says Joe Koenig's exceptional ability to gather and analyze information from key witnesses and documents has resulted in a truly compelling case that Walter Reca is the real DB Cooper. That was written by Kathleen McChesney, PhD. She was third in command at the FBI behind Robert Mueller. She was the lead investigator in the Ted Bundy case out in Seattle. Mm-hmm. And she had actually, and like I said, the highest ranking female FBI agent in the world, she endorsed the book. We have federal prosecutors that endorsed it, chiefs of police, FBI agents, special agents in charge. It was, I don't think anybody has endorsements like that.
No.
Agreed.
Wow.
That's just craziness.
Yeah. Yeah. It was an exciting 3 years. I'm kind of glad it's over.
You're like, it was a wild ride. Now let's get back to swimming with sharks.
Yeah, let's
calm it down a little bit, please.
Let's bring it down to a sane level here. You're right.
Yes. Yeah. Sharks, but not saltwater crocodiles. Let's be real.
I draw the line. Saltwater crocs, I don't do that. I go looking for great whites, but I don't look at all for I watch out for
it's crazy to me that those two like apex predators literally just live right together there.
Yes, yeah.
It's not fair that they live there together.
They're massive too. They're like 25 feet long.
Oh yes, humongous.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
I watched a couple documentaries on them. It is mind-boggling how large they are.
Yes, yeah. No, so I didn't get to dive with the great whites, but there were some tigers there that were about 20 foot. They were nice.
Well, Vern, thank you so much for spending your evening with us. I hope we had a blast. I can't wait till your book gets here. I ordered it yesterday, so good old Amazon. I'll have it here soon.
Well, good. Actually, did you order it through Amazon?
I did.
Did you? Yeah. We fulfill those. So I'll write a letter to you. Write it in. If you'd like. You. Ruin the book.
Absolutely.
Yes, I'm about to place my order, and I'm sure my husband is going to be like, "Let me read it first."
Yeah. Anyone who wants endorsements, they all come through my office, and so
love it.
I'll write you.
Perfect.
Awesome.
All right. Well,
yes, it was
thank
great
you again so much.
Oh, thanks so much. Enjoy it, you guys. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.